Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Very good evening, everyone. Going last actually feels a little bit like when my classes are scheduled right before lunch and, the students are interested in being elsewhere. But hopefully, what I'm going to do is start with what I usually do to my students, which is give them a quiz. But not a quiz. I'm going to ask a poll, actually, just to get the temperature of the room, just to kind of map where we are today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and I'm going to try to see you past these spotlights. Can you raise your hand if you have ever in your life read a novel set in America? Okay, quite a few hands. Great, great. Okay. So my second question is, can you raise your hand if you have ever in your life read a novel set in either Japan or Korea? A few. Okay. And finally, my last poll question. Can you raise a hand if you have ever read a novel set in Brunei? Okay, quite a few. I'm going to discount some of you because I know you're my friends, and so you've probably read my novel. But you'll have to take my word for it that generally when I ask these questions in schools, the number of hands raised for the third question is usually much fewer than the number of hands raised for the first or second. And I don't say that, and I think that was kind of the case today as well. And I don't say that to kind of blame anyone or shame anyone. It's really just to establish the reality of the landscape, the reading landscape in Brunei today. I just also wanted to share that I myself was 29 when I read my first Bruneian novel. And the reason that should be surprising is because of two reasons. The first reason is that I am Bruneian. I was born in Brunei. I grew up in Brunei. My primary school was PGGMB, Persekutuan Guru-Guru Melayu Brunei. I went to Maktab Sains Paduka Seri Bikawan Sultan for my secondary school. And then I was granted a government scholarship, and then I went on to do my A-levels, degree, master's and PhD in UK, before coming back to Brunei to serve my bond. And so far, this is a very Bruneian story, right? I don't want to say this is a representative history, but certainly I think it's not an unfamiliar trajectory for Bruneians, so it's fairly common. The second reason this should be surprising is that I'm a fairly motivated reader. My degrees were in literature and writing. Today I am in a couple of book clubs, and I generally read around 140 to 150 books a year. So I'm a fairly motivated reader. And I say these things to establish that it should be surprising that a fairly motivated Bruneian reader should not encounter a Bruneian novel until she is 29 years of age. And so the question that comes up is why, right? Like, why and how can this be so? And the answer is that I, like all of us, am a product of my environment. And the first aspect of this environment is language. Until I was in my 20s, I read primarily, almost exclusively in English. This is because I come from a mixed race household. So like many Bruneians, English was my first language. I was also born in the 1980s, which means that I entered into an education system in which English was the medium of instruction and the reading materials were English. So English is essentially the language of my Bruneian life. And so even though the first Bruneian novel was actually published in 1951, the first Bruneian novel in English was not published until 2009, when I was halfway through my PhD. And so until 2009, there was no material readily available for me to read. So the second factor is that even if I had wanted to read a Bruneian novel in Malay, it would not have been easy for me to encounter it. I did not, like many of you, have the opportunity to encounter it in school over the course of my education in Brunei, primarily because they were not introduced into the local curriculum until the 1990s. So these two factors, language and access, these were the two main factors which shaped my imaginative life in my early and my adolescent years. So this means two things. Firstly, that when I began writing myself, I naturally wrote in English, and I naturally wrote about worlds that I was familiar with. American high schools, British children, Regency, Regency settings, Da Vinci codes, things like that. It was not until I started a master's in writing and then a PhD that I really began to seriously consider what it meant to write in Brunei, to write about Brunei. And then when I did kind of confront this, when I attempted to write about Brunei, I found it incredibly difficult. It was difficult for the reason that I did not have a repository or a vocabulary of form or convention to draw on. I had to pull the world that I lived in onto the page in a way that I had not seen modeled before. I had to draw it from scratch, simply because I did not have a sense of how this existed in fiction previously. There were really small considerations, things like, how do I describe what the experience of being in secondary school in Brunei is like? What's that social world like? How do I convey the experience of the mall in Gadong being constructed and what that meant to hanging out after school, for example? Choices like, should I italicize words like tudong, or should I try to translate them into things like hijab or headscarf, which I felt had different connotations? How could I even translate the word baju kurung without being a little bit clunky on the page? Did I have to translate it? So these are all the small questions and small creative decisions that I had to contend with that I did not have to consider in the same way when I was writing things set in the US, for example, or in Britain. The pervasiveness of these books on the shelves and in my consciousness rendered their cultural setting neutral, invisible, in a way that I did not know yet how to replicate when writing about Brunei. So what this also means is that when I finally read my first Bruneian novel at the age of 29, it was not a matter of chance, but a decisive choice. So I was a visiting fellow in Oxford at the time, and I was doing some research on Bruneian ghost stories. And so to supplement my research, I asked my colleague in the Malay literature program to lend me a book called Pengabdian. And I read it, and it was revelatory. It really was. So for those of you who don't know, Pengabdian is the first prize winner of the inaugural novel writing competition held by Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka to commemorate Brunei's independence. And it is about a doctor called Siti Noor who comes back from her training in the UK to serve in a Brunei hospital. She enters into a love triangle with her Chinese schoolmate Sam and a Malay policeman called Shukri. She is the primary breadwinner for her household. She is the oldest daughter who looks after her other siblings. She negotiates with her expatriate colleagues in the hospital every day. It's really a story about religious conversion and about nation building. And it's not a perfect novel, but it was so familiar when I read it 30 years after it was published. Reading Pengabdian was the first time that I had seen the world that I had grown up with on the page in that particular way. Its ways and rhythms, its social lives and worlds. And that was really, it was really special to me to see this in a form that I had been familiar with for so long, a novel, seeing this familiar world, but still it was new because I had not seen it before. So I often think that if I had read this novel earlier, I might have been able to write Brunei earlier. And in the same year that I read this, the first readily accessible Bruneian novel in English came out. And so since then, I've never really looked back. Today, the landscape of Bruneian fiction is very different from the one that I grew up with. Apart from the rich history of novel writing in Malay, since that first Anglophone novel in 2009, there have been about 20 Bruneian novels in English published. All the main bookstores in Brunei today have a dedicated shelf or storefront that's dedicated to Bruneian writing. Bruneian books are on both the English and Malay curriculum at secondary and tertiary level, including in some of the classes that I teach. And I just feel how lucky we are as Bruneian readers and writers to live in this time. And yet normally when I ask this question about who has read a Bruneian novel before, really not much has changed from when I was younger. And so to me, what that means is that even though our environment is changing, we must also make a conscious effort to be a part of that change. We must be conscious of how we read and how we shape our internal imaginative selves. And this is not to say that we should stop reading from outside our cultural context. Definitely not. I think in today's world, we really need to continue reading as widely and generously as we can. It is to say that perhaps there is space to also read more. It's also to say that there is something uniquely powerful about reading something that is specific to our social, cultural, national history and heritage. And then in turn to write something about this heritage on the page, to imagine new futures that are specific to our current circumstances and beyond. In other words, it is powerful to inherit something like Jong Batu and then to imagine Kampung Ayer in, for example, the year 2050. This offers all of us, I think, a wider collective imagination. So they say that reading is biography. What we read is who we are. What we write is who we are. But of course, we can also choose what we read. And I believe very strongly that what we choose to read is also what we choose to read is also who we choose to know, what we choose to know, where we choose to know. What we choose to write can be who we choose to become. So I want to end tonight by inviting you all. The next time you choose something to read, maybe 1 book from now, 5 books from now, who knows? Maybe you can choose from one of these or from one of these. So thank you so much for being with me here tonight, and especially to the readers and writers of Brunei. Thank you very much.